Since the Reformation, people have gone back to Matthew 24 to try and read it in what is popularly known as a historicist or preterist way. So they have sought to return or redux Matthew 24. One of the popular ways of doing this is by reading this generation in Matthew 24, verse 34, when Jesus says, "This generation shall not pass away until all these things have been fulfilled." By all these things, he means what he just talked about, which was the prophecy of the parousia, or the second coming as it's known, the end of the age. So it's one question in two parts. So since the Reformation days, since Calvin and Luther, this has been interpreted as Jesus saying, in a generation which is typically, literally 40 years. And many of these followers claim that this happened in AD 70, but is that actually what Jesus said? Now we know that Jesus also said that he doesn't know the day or the hour or the times and the seasons. So that's Mark 13:32 and Acts 1:3. So we have to ask ourselves, is Jesus clearly contradicting himself here? Or is something else afoot? Is something else happening? So unnatural interpretations of this saying include the nation of Israel, or the Jewish race, or Jesus talking about that generation, the generation of his time, of his life. So these are, I believe, unnatural interpretations of the phrase, because again, we're back to square one. Either Jesus came back just before that whole generation of the nation, of his own Jewish race, his own generation, people around his age. He either came back, resurrected the dead, established a kingdom on earth, or he didn't. Unless, of course, you understand all those things I just said in a figurative, metaphoric way, but then we have to explain what all that means. What did the prophets mean by the restoration of the fallen tent, or the kingdom of David, the Davidic kingdom? What is behind the metaphor of the dead being raised back to life? Remember, Judaism does not have a going to heaven when you die belief. That actually was from the Egyptian Babylonian captivity days, where many Jews adopted those ideas. So this is yet another unnatural way of reading this generation. A more natural reading would be that Jesus is simply talking about this present evil age. So that's what Paul calls it in Galatians 1, verse 4. Why? Because in Matthew, throughout Matthew, as you can see in Matthew 12, chapters 16 and 17, and even in Luke 16, Jesus is constantly seen as talking about the wicked or adulterous or perverse generation of the age. In other words, by this generation, a more natural reading would be that Jesus is referring to the general times that we live in, the general generation that is wicked, perverse, and adulterous. And that's been true since the fall of Adam. So that's a more natural reading, and most importantly, a more biblical Jewish way of interpreting Jesus' words here. So what does this mean? This means that there has been obviously a big delay, a 2,000-year-old delay at least, but there are arguments for what many scholars have termed a messianic delay. So we have many parables. The parable of the persistent widow. This widow comes to the king, remember, and is pleading for justice and so on. And then the parable goes on to talk about how God will bring about judgment in his time, in his way. You also have the parable of the 10 coins or the minas in Luke 19. Remember, this is about the noble man of birth or the king who goes to a distant land. Before he goes, he gives these coins or treasures to some of his servants, and some of them misused them, some of them use it wisely, and so on. But the point there is that the king goes to a distant land. He goes away for a very long time, some translations say, in Luke 19. And lastly, you have the parable of the 10 virgins. Again, it's about waiting for this person called the bridegroom there, who was a long time in coming, it says in Matthew 25. So once again, like the persistent widow, like the people who are given the coins or the treasures, it's about persistence in prayer and waiting in faith. That is, in the belief that this Messiah figure will one day come back. And furthermore, the day of the Lord is always near or at hand throughout the prophets. So you have Zephaniah, Ezekiel, Obadiah, Joel. If you read those verses, if you look them up in the context, you'll see that they're always talking about the day of the Lord as something that is near or even here or at hand, depending on the translation. This is a typical Jewish prophetic way of talking about God's coming judgment and restoration of his people. And of course, Jesus is the last great prophet, the prophet of Deuteronomy 18:18. He's the last mouthpiece of God, and as such, he continues this trend. He talks about the gospel about the kingdom that is coming. Those are the first words out of his mouth in Mark 1:14 and 15. So that day of the Lord, that kingdom, that good news of God is near, so we should repent, he says. So again, it's always near, but not here.